These questions really focus not only on exploration and some of the obstacles that explorers face, but they really focus more on some of the implications and the impact and the outcomes of exploration, not only for Europe, but for the countries that they colonized. So, what were some of the obstacles that sailors faced? They had a lot of poor maps. Again, they didn't understand, they had poor map making tools, but they also didn't understand the size and the scope of the world at the time. So it's like looking at a baseball and comparing it to a volleyball. And the size and scope is quite different. Because of that, you saw a lot of the explorers, at least the first explorers, they didn't bring enough supplies. They didn't bring adequate supplies and they would run out. Also, the same thing with food. If you don't know how long the destination is, it makes it hard to plan and be adequately prepared. So poor supplies and food shortages was a big problem. And that obviously resulted in men starving and dying due to malnutrition. And so they didn't have a lot of fruit. They couldn't keep a lot of fresh items on the boat to preserve them. And so this caused scurvy and some other things that explorers battled. But they also, once they were on different continents, they were exposed to diseases that they were exposed to and they had no immunities for. So that caused them to obviously get sick and in many cases die. Okay, so in looking at some of the key motivations for Europeans during the Age of Exploration, Europeans wanted spices, but the Italian and Muslims really controlled most of those trade routes. So in order for Europeans to kind of get around that, they needed to find different trade routes. They really literally needed to get around the Italians and the Muslims. And consider when you're looking at a map, Italy was controlling the Mediterranean Sea, and the Muslims were controlling those trade routes through Asia and some of the waters through the Muslim country and empire. And so every time those products exchanged hands, the price was high. So that made Europeans have to pay a much higher price for products than they normally would have. Europeans were also looking to gain fame and glory from conquering and controlling foreign lands. So really it was a big, giant competition in many ways to outdo the other empires that were nearby and neighboring empires. The more land they acquired, the more wealth they acquired, and it was sort of, I guess, a win for the team. So think of it like a big competition. Missionaries and explorers also wanted to spread Christianity. So that was kind of the third motivation. So when you kind of think of these, you think of gold, God, and glory. So gold was really the trade routes and the spices and everything that was traded, not just gold. And the empires trying to control land and get as much land and acquisition colonies as they could, that was glory. And then the spreading of Christianity was God. So the next question was, what key advances in knowledge and technology allowed Europeans to explore these new areas? So map making really, once they started sharing ideas and mapping the world more accurately, obviously this made a big difference in being able to navigate better. They also had better navigational tools. The development of the compass and the ability to kind of map out once on the water, they had some ways that they could map out where they were going. They obviously had weapons that were superior, and this allowed them to conquer the native people that they encountered, and so that gave Europeans a superior advantage in comparison to the people that they were conquering. One of the other interesting advantages too was the boats. So if you think about the big pirate boats, they were large, they were hard to navigate. They started building boats that were flatter at the bottom, and they were lighter, and they had 3 small sails, and they were much easier to navigate and turn quickly. They also could catch wind at different points. So when the wind changed direction, it was easier to navigate and get around. So that was some technology advancements that made it easier to sail. Okay, so let's look at Portuguese exploration and the impact that Portuguese exploration and their sailors had on the following continents. So in Asia, the Portuguese seized seaports in India and dominated the trade routes in the Spice Islands, which is modern-day Indonesia. So the prices of goods in Asia dropped. Well, and in Europe, they dropped as well. Why would that be? Because they've cut out a lot of those middlemen, and so the prices for Europeans dropped. But also, you had people controlling the trade routes and controlling the price. In Africa, when Brazil's native people died, so in essence, when Europeans came over to South America and Brazil, they would enslave the native people, and they would work them in the fields and in the mines. And when those native people died, they didn't have anybody to work in their fields. So they looked to Africa and the labor force there in the Americas for a labor force in the Americas, because they had large plantations, they had mines, they needed a workforce. And so they used the people that were available. When those people that were available died due to overwork and disease, they then looked at another continent, which was Africa. And interestingly enough, Europeans were not the first to start slavery. They really got their cue from the Muslim empire, and the Muslims had been trading African slaves for a period of time prior to this. And so they continued and piggybacked on that, and unfortunately used the native people in Africa for slavery to work in those plantations and the mines, but mainly plantations in South America and Central America, and as well as North America. So what impact did it have on the Americas? Well, the native people were first forced to work on plantations under really, really horrific conditions. Much of the native population died off due to overwork and disease. And again, the big disease that they were exposed to was smallpox. Lots of other diseases as well, was really transmitted between both Europeans and the native people in the Americas. But the deadliest one, the Europeans had immunity to, and that was smallpox. And so they have different estimates, anywhere from 80 to 90% of their population. So let's look at some of the Spanish exploration and the impact that they made. So what explorers made a difference for Spain? Well, you've got Christopher Columbus. Now again, we know that he was not the first to actually find the Americas. When he first sailed to the Caribbean islands or the Bahamas, he thought he was in India. He thought he had found a shortcut to Asia, and he called it the West Indies versus the East Indies. And he came back and still did not realize that he had not discovered, or had discovered, a new continent for Europeans. They originally thought, again, that he was in India and Asia. So once they had realized that they were really truly new lands, this opened up a whole new world for Spain to colonize. So the impact that exploration had on the people of the continents. So Europeans learned of a whole new world and land over in the North Americas and South America and Central America. They also realized they could now sail across the globe, and that was one of the other big explorers was Magellan, and he was the first to circumnavigate the world. New crops were developed, and Spain grew really, really wealthy from the land and the resources that they extracted from the native people. And because of that, one group of people were kind of, if we want to classify them, they had a lot of loss where Europeans gained. In the Americas, many native people were forced to become Christians. Some did it willingly and converted willingly. Others were forced into Christianity. Additionally, They were used as forced labor in mines and plantations. And again, much like what the Portuguese did, many died due to starvation, overwork, and largely diseases. And smallpox was truly, truly devastating. They've shown pictures and sketchings of the people with the disease. And once it started and you were exposed, they really had no immunities and no protection. So the impact of exploration on North America, and so how did colonization and exploration differ in the Americas, in the North versus the South? Well, gold wasn't discovered in the North part of America, in like Canada. So there was really originally little interest in setting up settlements or colonies there compared to Central and South America, where they had discovered mineral wealth, gold and silver. Rather, they set up a string of trade posts in Canada or North America, and they really started, that's really where they started trading fur, and that became a valuable asset in Canada. So what impact did European exploration have on North America? The trading posts were set up in North America. They really fought. The two big superpowers in the world at the time were the Spanish, the English, that controlled North America, and they were really fighting over the land and the power and control of those areas. Okay, let's look at the last part of this, and that is the terms. Capitalism. It's an economic system based on investing money for profit. Okay, so you take your money, you invest it, and hopefully you make a profit because you want extra money when you come out. You don't want to spend it and come out even. In a market economy, and when we were talking about economics, this is a type of economy where buyers and sellers, or supply and demand, determine the price. So in this type of market, you let buyers decide what they want to buy, and you let suppliers or sellers decide how much they're going to make, and they set their price based on the supply and demand that's available. Mercantilism. This is really an economic policy with which nations try to gather as much gold and silver as possible by controlling the trade routes and establishing colonies. So controlling trade routes and colonies, it's this idea that they had like this limited supply and they had to try to get as much as they could. And that was kind of the idea behind that economic policy. So how did exploration help create the commercial revolution in Europe? You basically, the result of exploration where you have a lot of raw materials, and there was a lot of shared ideas during this phase. We had the Renaissance. You had all these new ideas being shared and developments occurring. You had precious metals entering Europe. So with all of these raw materials, you start to see and the innovations that were coming to the market. You saw the innovation of like in the Industrial Revolution and kind of mass production. So trade routes expanded, new centers of commerce had developed. And that kind of rounds us out for a lot of the questions that we covered in class today. I hope this was helpful.